If you're 55 or older and picking a retirement state based only on whether it charges income tax, you're already making the mistake I almost made. I looked at Florida. No income tax. I figured that settled it. Then I actually ran my numbers, pension, 401k, Social Security, state by state, line by line. What I found changed my whole plan. 2 retirees, same $120,000 income, same pension, same Social Security. One of them hands over $7,000 a year to their state. The other keeps every dollar of it. That's not a rounding error. Over a full retirement, that's the difference between running out of money at 78 and never thinking about it again. I'm going to show you the 5 states where your money goes furthest and the 3 where it quietly gets taken apart, including one most people assume is safe. It isn't. $7,000 a year. Sit with that number for a second because it's not hypothetical. It's what one retiree in this country is losing right now, every single year, simply because of the state printed on their driver's license. If you want more of this, the real numbers behind where your money actually goes in retirement, not the guesswork, go ahead and subscribe now, because this is exactly the kind of thing I break down every week. I want to tell you about a guy named Gary, retired postal worker, 31 years on the job, out of Cleveland. When Gary retired at 62, he did what a lot of people do. He looked at a map, saw Tennessee had no state income tax, and figured that was the whole equation solved. Sold the house, packed up, moved to a little place outside Knoxville. Here's what Gary didn't check. Tennessee has one of the highest combined state and local sales tax rates in the country, over 9.5% on almost everything he buys. Groceries, furniture, the truck he needed for the move, no income tax on his pension, sure. But every dollar he spent walking back out the door at nearly 10 cents on the dollar, he told me it snuck up on him in pieces. A grocery run that felt $15 too expensive. Then the hardware store. Then property tax season, which in his new county came in higher than he'd budgeted for, because he'd only ever compared income tax rates, never property tax, never sales tax. He built a decision that would shape the rest of his life on one column out of 4. Gary called me 8 months after the move. He wasn't angry, he was just tired. I did the smart thing, he told me. Everybody said no income tax, no income tax. Nobody told me to look anywhere else. There was a long pause on the line after that. I didn't fill it. Some silences say more than the next sentence would. That's the trap. 9 states in this country charge 0 income tax. Wyoming, Florida, Texas, Nevada, South Dakota, Tennessee, Washington, Alaska, and New Hampshire. That part's true and it matters, but income tax is one column in a much bigger spreadsheet, and if it's the only column you check, you're making a decision with a quarter of the information. There are actually 13 states that go a step further and fully exempt retirement income specifically, Social Security, pensions, 401k and IRA withdrawals, all of it, even though those states still tax your paycheck if you're working. That's a completely different list than the no income tax list, and almost nobody separates the two. I didn't separate them either the first time I looked at this. I'll admit that. Years ago, when I was first mapping out where I might land eventually, I made almost the same mistake Gary made. I saw no income tax on a list and mentally filed a state under good without checking what that state did with property tax, or whether it taxed my specific mix of pension and 401k withdrawals the same way. It took a spreadsheet and a few embarrassing hours to realize how incomplete that shortcut was. Gary's story isn't over, by the way. What he did next, about 18 months later, is the kind of correction most people never make, because most people don't find out what he found out. But before I get to that, I need to walk you through the 5 states that actually get this right, and the very first one on that list is going to surprise you because it's not the one you're thinking of. The state that surprised me isn't Florida. It isn't Texas either. Every retirement channel on this platform points you at the same 3 no-income tax states and calls it a day. I'm not going to do that to you because the real answer is more interesting, and it's going to change how you think about this whole decision. But before I show you that state, I want you to hold on to one idea. No income tax and tax-friendly for retirees are not the same sentence. They overlap, but they're not identical. Some states charge you income tax on your paycheck and then turn around and take almost nothing from your Social Security, your pension, or your 401k withdrawals. That's the category most people never even think to check. Pennsylvania is a good example. Flat 3.07% income tax sounds unfriendly on paper. But once you hit retirement age, Pennsylvania exempts nearly all of it. Social Security, pension income, 401k, and IRA withdrawals all off the table. A working 30-year-old in Philadelphia pays that 3.07%. A retiree living 2 blocks away, pulling from the same accounts you're building right now, pays close to nothing. I want to sit on that for a second because it's the exact opposite of what most people assume. People hear income tax state and mentally cross it off the list before checking anything else. That instinct is understandable. Nobody wants to do 50 spreadsheets before picking a zip code. But that instinct is also exactly what cost Gary his 8 months of quiet frustration in Tennessee. The label on the state isn't the whole story. The label on your specific income is. Illinois does something similar, and it's an even bigger surprise because Illinois has a reputation, high property taxes, a state everyone assumes is expensive to grow old in. And property taxes there are real. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But on the income side, Illinois fully exempts Social Security, pensions, and qualified retirement account withdrawals. If your income is mostly coming from those sources rather than a paycheck, Illinois behaves almost like a no-tax state, even though it isn't one. Then there's Wyoming, and this one's straightforward. No income tax, no estate tax, no inheritance tax, and one of the lowest overall tax burdens in the country by nearly every independent ranking, including the one that put it at the top of the list for 2026, low property taxes too. It's remote for some people, I know that's a real consideration, and I'm not going to pretend a place is perfect just because the math works. But if the number on the page is what matters most to you, Wyoming is hard to beat. I'll say this plainly because I don't think enough people in this space say it. Wyoming isn't right for everyone, and neither is any state on this list. If your grandkids are in Ohio and you need to see them every weekend, the best tax state in the country isn't the best state for you. I'm not here to sell you a spreadsheet. I'm here to make sure the spreadsheet is at least part of the conversation, because for a lot of people it currently isn't. Florida earns its reputation honestly. No income tax, no estate tax, no inheritance tax, and it's not remote the way Wyoming is. That combination is exactly why so many people move there without checking anything else, the same way Gary looked at Tennessee. The difference is Florida's other numbers happen to hold up reasonably well. Property taxes sit near the middle of the pack nationally. Sales tax is close to average. It's not a coincidence Florida keeps showing up on these lists. It earns it across most of the board, not just on the one column everybody checks first. That's 4 states in, and I haven't even gotten to the one that actually took me by surprise the first time I dug into this research, the state that quietly beats Florida on more than one metric. Before I get there, though, I want to ask you something. Has this happened to you? Picking a place or even just picturing a place based on one number, only to find out later there was a lot more to the story? Drop it in the comments. I read every one of them, and it helps me know what to dig into next. Because here's the thing about that 5th state. Almost nobody puts it on their list. And once you see the numbers, you'll understand why that's a mistake. South Dakota. That's the fifth state, and I'd bet most of you didn't have it on your list, because I didn't either the first time I ran these numbers. No income tax, same as Wyoming, same as Florida. No estate tax, no inheritance tax. But here's where it pulls ahead of Florida specifically. South Dakota ranked third best in the entire country for retirees in the most recent independent state-by-state comparison, and it didn't get there on tax numbers alone. It has one of the lowest rates of social isolation for seniors nationwide, some of the best geriatric hospital access in the country, low poverty rates among people 65 and older, clean air, clean water, and a tax bill that looks almost identical to Wyoming's. I want to be honest about why that surprised me, because it says something about how these decisions actually get made. When I picture good state for retirement, my brain automatically goes to warm weather and a beach. That's marketing, not math. Nobody's running television ads for Sioux Falls in February. But the numbers don't care what the postcard looks like. They care what happens to your $7,200 catch-up contribution the day it becomes a withdrawal instead of a deposit. And on that specific question, South Dakota answers about as well as any state in the country. Nobody puts South Dakota on a retirement list because it doesn't have a marketing department the way Florida does. Nobody's making a movie about retiring in Sioux Falls. But if you strip away the palm trees and just look at what happens to your money and your health care access, it's sitting quietly near the top, and almost nobody's talking about it. So that's your five: Wyoming, Florida, South Dakota, the no-income tax trio that also holds up on the details most people never check. Pennsylvania and Illinois, states that tax your paycheck but leave your retirement income almost completely alone. 5 very different states, 5 very different reasons to end up on this list. And the common thread isn't no income tax. The common thread is somebody actually checked before deciding. Now I have to tell you about the other side of this because it matters just as much, maybe more. There are states where the math works against you so quietly that most people don't notice until they've already lost years of compounding to it. I want to go back to Gary for a second because this is where his story actually turns. About 18 months after he moved to Tennessee, sat through that sales tax sticker shock and had that quiet phone call with me. He did something most people in his position never do. He didn't move again right away. He didn't panic, and he didn't just grit his teeth and accept it either, which is what a lot of people do once they've already sold the house and signed the paperwork. Instead, he sat down at his kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon, pulled out the same kind of spreadsheet I'd built for myself years earlier, and started running the real numbers on where he actually was, instead of where he'd assumed he was when he made the decision. What he found surprised him almost as much as the sales tax bill had. It turned out the specific mix of his pension and his Social Security meant his overall tax burden in Tennessee, once you counted everything, wasn't actually the disaster he'd started to believe it was. It was one particular category he'd overlooked, and once he adjusted for it, the picture changed. I'll get into exactly what he found later because it connects directly to the worst offender on this entire list, the one I mentioned right at the very beginning, the one most people assume is completely safe. But first, you need to see the 3 states where retirees are losing the most money, because the contrast is what makes all of this click into place. And the worst one on this list isn't even close. Not even close. Remember that because by the end of this, you'll understand exactly what I mean. Let's start with the state that's the mildest of the 3 worst. Mild only compared to what's coming, because on its own, it's still a real problem for a lot of retirees. Minnesota. Minnesota is one of only 8 states left in the country that still taxes Social Security benefits. 8 out of 50. That number alone should stop you for a second, because it means 42 states have already decided that taxing a benefit you paid into your entire working life doesn't make sense. Minnesota hasn't gotten there yet. On top of that, Minnesota's lowest income tax bracket is high compared to most states. You don't get eased in gently the way you do elsewhere. There's an estate tax, too, on estates over $3 million, which won't touch most people watching this, but it's one more data point in a state that keeps choosing to tax rather than exempt. Here's what makes Minnesota specifically frustrating, and it's the same lesson from Gary's story wearing a different hat. It's not that Minnesota is uniquely terrible. It's that it looks completely fine on the surface, a Midwestern state, reasonable cost of living, good health care, right up until you actually run your Social Security and your investment withdrawals through their tax code and watch the number come out higher than you expected. Now let's talk about Vermont, because Vermont takes the same problem and makes it sharper. Vermont also taxes Social Security, but with a twist that catches people off guard. The exemption phases out fast. If you're a joint filer and your adjusted gross income creeps above $65,000, you start losing that exemption and it disappears completely above $75,000. For a single filer, that window is even tighter. Full exemption up to $50,000, gone completely by $60,000. Sit with that for a second, because $60,000 in retirement income is not a luxury number. That's a modest pension plus Social Security for a lot of people in this audience. It's not the ultra-wealthy getting caught in that phase-out. It's ordinary retirees who did everything right, saved consistently, maybe used those catch-up contributions I keep coming back to, and then find themselves right in the middle of that income band where the exemption starts disappearing. I've heard from people in exactly that spot. Not a dramatic story like Gary's, just a quiet, ongoing frustration. Doing the math every April and realizing the number is bigger than it should be, and not fully understanding why until they actually sat down and read the fine print on how the phase-out works. That's the thing about a phase-out. It doesn't announce itself. There's no letter that arrives saying, "Congratulations, you've crossed a threshold." It just shows up as a slightly smaller refund or a slightly bigger bill year after year, and most people chalk it up to inflation or a bad accountant before they ever trace it back to the actual cause. Connecticut belongs in this same conversation, by the way, even though I'm not giving it its own full breakdown here. Same basic pattern: Social Security taxation with income-based exemptions, brackets that climb higher than most of the country, and a cost of living that compounds the problem rather than offsetting it. If you're looking at the Northeast specifically, the pattern repeats itself state after state. Taxes stack on top of an already expensive place to live, and retirees end up absorbing both at once. 2 states in, and neither of them is even the worst one. I told you at the very start of this video that the worst state isn't close, and I meant that. What's coming next isn't a state that quietly nibbles away at your income through a phase-out or a high bracket. It's a state that treats almost every dollar of your retirement income exactly the same way it treats a paycheck. Full ordinary income tax rates, no special break for the fact that you spent 40 years earning that money. And once I show you the actual side-by-side number, you're going to understand why I opened this entire video with it. California. That's the state I've been building toward this entire video, and before I show you the number, I need you to actually picture 2 people, because an abstract statistic doesn't land the same way a real comparison does. 2 retirees. Same $120,000 in annual income, a mix of Social Security, a modest pension, and 401k withdrawals, the exact kind of income most of you watching this are working toward right now. Same age, same asset allocation. The only difference between them is the state printed on their tax return. One of them lives in Wyoming, the other lives in California. Here's the number. According to a detailed 2026 state tax analysis built directly from Tax Foundation data, the retiree in California pays roughly $7,200 more in state income tax every single year than the retiree in Wyoming. Same income, same life. $7,200 gone every year. simply because of a zip code. Now stretch that across a 25-year retirement, which isn't a dramatic assumption anymore. People are living longer, and a lot of you watching this will spend a quarter century or more in retirement. That $7,200 a year compounds into more than $180,000 in lost after-tax spending capacity. $180,000. That's not a number that shows up once and disappears. That's a number that could have covered a grandchild's college fund, a long-term care buffer, a decade of the travel you spent 30 years promising yourself. I've sat with that number for a while now, and I keep coming back to the same thought. Nobody decides to lose $180,000. Nobody wakes up and says that's an acceptable trade. It happens 1 year at a time, $7,000 at a time, quietly enough that most people never actually add it up. You'd have to sit down year by year and watch the number accumulate to feel the full weight of it. Most people never do that math. They just feel a general sense that money's tighter than it should be, without ever tracing it back to a decision made years earlier, sometimes a decision made before they'd even retired. I want to be precise about why California ends up here, because it's not one single villain, it's a stack of decisions. California taxes pensions and 401k and IRA withdrawals as ordinary income at rates that climb up to 13.3% at the top end, among the highest marginal rates in the entire country. It does exempt Social Security, which is worth acknowledging because it's not the worst state on every single metric. But once you're pulling meaningful income from a pension or a retirement account, that exemption covers a shrinking fraction of your total picture, and the rest gets taxed at rates most other states don't come close to. Before I go any further, I want to pause on something, because this is exactly the kind of number that's easy to scroll past and hard to actually act on. Seeing your own situation laid out against a real comparison like this one hits differently than a general statistic ever could. It's the difference between taxes matter and here's what it actually costs you specifically. This is the part where I have to be fair, though, because California isn't a trap for everyone the same way. If your income is coming almost entirely from Social Security and a small pension, and you're not pulling much from a 401k, the picture looks meaningfully different than what I just described. I'm not going to pretend one number applies identically to every single person watching this. That would be exactly the kind of oversimplification I've spent this whole video arguing against. But for a lot of you, the ones who built a serious 401k, the ones who used those catch-up contributions I keep mentioning, the ones with real portfolios instead of just Social Security, California is the single most expensive place in this comparison to spend that money. And that number I just gave you isn't the end of the story. It's the number that finally made Gary pick up the phone and call me back. The number that finally made Gary pick up the phone. I want you to hold on to that phrase because we're about to close the loop on it, and it connects directly to the state I mentioned at the very start of this video, the one most people assume is completely safe. When Gary ran his own numbers, here's what he found. Tennessee, despite the sales tax sticker shock, actually worked out fine for his specific situation. His income was modest enough and the property he bought was inexpensive enough that the sales tax hit, while real, didn't outweigh the zero income tax on his pension. He wasn't thrilled about the sales tax, but once he ran the full comparison instead of just the one column he'd checked originally, the picture was actually closer to okay than he'd feared during those 8 rough months. What actually unsettled him was a phone call with his sister, who'd made a completely different assumption a decade earlier. She'd stayed in New York, never moved at all actually, which is its own kind of decision people rarely think to question. She'd always figured she was fine on the tax front because New York doesn't tax Social Security and doesn't tax public pensions either. She'd heard that fact once years ago, filed it under settled, and never revisited it. Here's what she never checked: property taxes. New York has some of the highest property tax bills in the entire country, and it's not close. In a lot of counties outside New York City, the annual property tax bill on an ordinary, unremarkable home runs well into 5 figures. I'm talking $8, $9, sometimes $10,000 a year every year for as long as you own the home. That's not a one-time cost. That's a recurring bill that lands whether your income is high or low that year, whether the market's up or down, whether you're using more of your savings than you planned to. Her Social Security wasn't taxed. Her small teacher's pension wasn't taxed. On paper, by the one metric she'd checked, New York looked completely safe. But her property tax bill alone, every single year, outweighed whatever she'd saved on income tax by a wide margin. Gary walked her through the math on that same phone call, actually sat down with her over the phone and worked through it together. And the numbers surprised her as much as the sales tax bill had once surprised him. This is exactly the trap I opened this video with. No income tax isn't the only column. Doesn't tax Social Security isn't the only column either. New York proves that a state can look completely safe on the specific metric everyone checks first, and still be one of the most expensive places in the country to actually own a home and grow old in it. That's why New York belongs on this list of states to think carefully about, right alongside California, even though the mechanism is completely different. I've been doing this work, building spreadsheets, comparing states, running my own numbers and other people's, for going on 5 years now, ever since I turned 50 and stumbled onto the catch-up contribution rule that changed my own trajectory. And if there's one thing I keep relearning, it's this. The states that hurt people the most aren't always the ones that look scary. Sometimes they're the ones that look completely fine, right up until you actually check. Think about the pattern across everything we've covered. Minnesota looks like an unremarkable Midwestern state until you check the Social Security tax. Vermont looks manageable until you hit that exemption phase-out at a completely ordinary income level. California gets talked about constantly for its cost of living, but people still underestimate exactly how much of a $120,000 retirement income disappears into state tax there. And New York might be the sharpest example of all because the specific fact everyone repeats about it, they don't tax Social Security, is completely true and completely beside the point if you own a home there. None of these are villain states run by people trying to trap retirees. They're just states with tax codes built the way tax codes get built, piece by piece, decade by decade, by legislatures solving different problems at different times. The property tax structure in New York wasn't designed as a retirement trap. It just happens to function like one for someone who only checked the income tax line. You've seen 5 states that get this right and 3 that don't, for 3 completely different reasons. Minnesota and Vermont taxing Social Security directly, California taxing retirement withdrawals at some of the highest rates in the country, and New York hiding its cost in property tax instead of income tax. 3 different traps, one common thread. Nobody in any of these stories was careless. They just checked one number instead of 4. There's one more thing I want to show you before we're done here, and it's the piece that actually ties Gary's whole story together. What he decided to do next, once he and his sister had both finally seen their full numbers laid out side by side. Here's what Gary decided after all of it: the sales tax shock, the quiet months, the phone call with his sister. Not right away. It took him a few weeks of sitting with the full picture, running his numbers next to hers, understanding for the first time what each of them had actually gotten right and gotten wrong. He stayed in Tennessee. That surprised me a little, honestly, when he told me. After everything, the sales tax sticker shock, the 8 rough months, the frustration in his voice on that first phone call, I half expected him to start packing again, maybe back toward Ohio, somewhere familiar. But he didn't, because once he ran the complete comparison instead of the single column he'd checked the first time, Tennessee held up. His pension stayed untouched. His property tax was reasonable. The sales tax was real, but smaller than it had felt when it was the only number he understood. He told me something on that call that I haven't been able to shake since. He said the worst 8 months weren't actually about the money. They were about not knowing whether the money was a problem. Every grocery run, every hardware store trip, he'd feel that little sting and not know if it was adding up to something serious or if he was just imagining it. The not knowing was worse than any actual number turned out to be. Once he sat down and got the real answer, even a mediocre answer, even an answer with a real cost attached to it, something in him settled. He wasn't wrong to be frustrated 8 months in. He was wrong to think frustration meant he'd made a mistake. Those turned out to be two different things, and most people never get far enough into the numbers to find out which one they're actually dealing with. His sister made a different call. She's still in New York. She's not moving either, not yet. Her whole life is there. Her grandkids are 15 minutes away, and no spreadsheet was going to change that. But she did something she hadn't done in the 10 years she'd been telling herself she was tax safe. She looked into New York's senior property tax exemption programs, the enhanced STAR exemption specifically, which reduces the taxable assessed value of a primary home for qualifying residents 65 and older. Depending on the county and the assessed value of the home, that exemption can knock a real percentage off an annual bill that had been running close to $9,000 a year. She hadn't known the program existed. Nobody had told her. She'd just filed New York under fine a decade ago, the day she confirmed Social Security wasn't taxed, and never opened that file again. Gary told me she went quiet on the phone for a second when the math actually landed. Not the bad kind of quiet, the other kind. The kind where you realize a problem you'd been quietly carrying for years had an actual door out of it the whole time, and you just never went looking for the door. He said it reminded him of his own 8 months in Tennessee. Not the specifics, but the shape of it. Both of them had built a version of their financial life around one fact they'd confirmed once, years apart, in completely different states, and then never questioned again. Two siblings, two coasts apart in personality if not in miles, making the exact same category of mistake without either one knowing the other had made it too. That's what actually got to me about this story, more than any of the tax brackets or exemption thresholds. It's not that Gary or his sister were careless people. Anyone who's spent 30 years in a steady career, raised a family, kept a household running, knows how to pay attention to things that matter. It's that this particular kind of number, the state tax kind, doesn't announce itself the way a broken furnace or a car repair does. It just sits quietly in the background of your life, shaping your spending power a little at a time for decades, unless you go find it and look it in the eye. That's the whole video, if I'm honest with you. Not Wyoming, not California, not even the $7,200. It's a man in Tennessee who thought he'd failed and found out he'd actually landed fine, and his sister in New York who thought she was fine and found out there was a door she'd never opened. Two people, two states, two assumptions that turned out to be almost exactly backwards from what they expected. I think about my own $7,200 sometimes, the number I started with at 47, sitting in that banking app, 22 years of work reduced to almost nothing. For a long time, I assumed that number told me everything I needed to know about where I stood. It didn't. It was just the one column I'd happened to check. The real picture didn't show up until I stopped assuming and started running actual numbers. My real spending, my real accounts. Eventually, the real tax code once I got old enough for it to matter the way it matters for you right now. Gary's sales tax bill and my $7,200 aren't the same number, but they taught me the same lesson from two different directions. The number that scares you isn't always the real problem, and the number that comforts you isn't always safe either. The only way to know which one you're holding is to actually check. You're not Gary and you're not his sister. Your income is different. Your state might not even be on this list. But I'd bet almost everyone watching this has one number they checked years ago, filed under settled, and never looked at again. Maybe it's an income tax rate. Maybe it's a property tax bill. Maybe it's something about your own 401k you assumed instead of confirmed. I'm not going to tell you checking guarantees you'll like what you find. Gary didn't love his sales tax bill anymore after he understood it. He just stopped being afraid of it because a known cost is a different thing than an unknown one. His sister didn't get all $9,000 back. The exemption covers a percentage, not the whole bill. And there's a real chance some of you watching this will run your own numbers and find a problem instead of relief. That happens. I'm not going to pretend this video ends with everyone discovering they're secretly fine. Some of you are going to check and confirm something you'd rather not have confirmed. That's still better than not knowing. Here's the part that actually matters, though, the part underneath all 5 best states and all 3 worst ones. Every single number in this video, the $7,200, the 9 states with 0 income tax, the 8 states still taxing Social Security, the $9,000 or $10,000 in New York property tax. Every one of those numbers was sitting there the whole time, publicly available, waiting for someone to go look. Nobody hid any of this from Gary. Nobody hid it from his sister. Nobody's hiding it from you right now. The only thing standing between settled and actually checked is deciding to spend 20 minutes finding out. I didn't have anyone showing me numbers like this at 47. I had a banking app, $7,200, and a very quiet apartment. Everything I know now, I found out the slow way, the expensive way, honestly, given what those first mistakes cost me. Nobody sat me down with a spreadsheet. I had to build my own, badly, at a kitchen table, after work, most nights for the better part of a year before it started to make sense. If this video saved you even one of those slow, expensive lessons, then it did what I built this channel to do. That's not a grand promise. It's just the actual reason I sit down and make these. I share this kind of thing every week. Real numbers, real comparisons, no guessing. So if today's the day you finally check the number you've been assuming, go ahead and subscribe now because this channel exists for exactly that moment. Take a breath before you go looking, though. There's no version of this where panic helps you. Panic is what sent me into crypto and a 3-week day trading disaster back at 47. Calm is what actually moves the number. And if today's video made you wonder what your own state is actually doing to your Social Security specifically, not pensions, not 401ks, just Social Security, because the rules there are stranger and more specific than almost anyone realizes, that's the next video I've got waiting for you. Go watch that one next. I was you 8 years ago, sitting in a quiet apartment, staring at a number that felt like the whole verdict on my life, when it was really just 1 column out of 4. Still figuring pieces of this out, same as you are right now, 8 years in and counting. The difference is I finally started checking. That's it. That's the whole difference. Not smarter, not luckier, just willing to open the file I'd already closed.